You're sitting in a Texas prison cell. It's 2004. You've been here for 17 years for a murder you didn't commit. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The conviction took less than 2 hours of jury deliberation. And the evidence that sent you to death row? A forensic expert testified that your teeth matched bite marks on the victim's body. There was just one problem. The science was fundamentally broken. This is the story of how forensic experts, sometimes with the best of intentions, sometimes with dangerous negligence, became architects of wrongful convictions. And how DNA evidence, decades later, finally told the truth. Welcome back to the Verdict Room, where we investigate the cases that expose the cracks in America's criminal justice system. Today, we're examining 3 real cases where flawed forensic science sent innocent men toward death row, and what their exonerations reveal about the state of expert testimony in 2026. Our first case takes us to Oklahoma in 1987. A woman named Donna Denise Dardeen is murdered in her home. She's been brutally attacked. The crime scene is chaotic, the evidence contaminated by the standards of today. But investigators focus on one piece of physical evidence: bite marks on the victim's body. Police have a suspect, a man named Robert Lee Stinson, and a forensic odontologist, an expert in analyzing bite marks, is called to testify. This expert examined the marks and declared, with seeming scientific certainty, that Stinson's teeth matched the bite marks on the victim. The testimony was devastating. The jury convicted him. Stinson was sentenced to death. For decades, Robert Lee Stinson sat on death row, maintaining his innocence. The bite mark evidence had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But bite mark analysis, the practice of comparing bite marks found on a victim's body or crime scene to a suspect's dental records, has a dark secret. It's not scientifically reliable. In fact, it's barely science at all. Here's why. Unlike fingerprints, which leave consistent, measurable ridge patterns, bite marks are highly variable. Human skin is elastic. It distorts. It moves. When someone is bitten, the mark changes as the skin heals. Bite marks on a body can be caused by multiple people or even animals. Yet for decades, forensic odontologists testified with absolute certainty that specific bite marks matched specific individuals. They used phrases like consistent with, or consistent with and likely to have been caused by, language that sounds precise but is deeply subjective. In reality, no 2 dental experts examining the same bite mark will necessarily reach the same conclusion. By the early 2000s, the scientific community was sounding alarms. Bite mark analysis had never been validated through rigorous scientific testing. There was no peer-reviewed research establishing that it could reliably match bite marks to individuals. And yet, it was being used to send people to death row. In Stinson's case, it took DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, evidence that didn't exist in its modern form when he was convicted, to exonerate him. In 2004, DNA analysis proved that Stinson was innocent. He had spent nearly 2 decades in prison based on testimony from an expert making claims that science could not support. Stinson's case is not an anomaly. Across America, bite mark evidence has contributed to at least 13 exonerations. 13 people who came dangerously close to execution based on testimony that a jury believed was scientific fact, but which the scientific community now recognizes as pseudoscience. In 2020, the American Board of Forensic Odontology quietly abandoned the term match. They no longer allow their members to testify that bite marks match a suspect's teeth. The damage, however, was already done. Our second case is equally damning, and it involves an even more widely trusted forensic method: fingerprint analysis. Meet Roy Brown. In 1990, he was convicted of murder in Buffalo, New York, based primarily on fingerprint evidence. A forensic examiner testified that Roy Brown's fingerprints matched prints found at the crime scene. The expert was emphatic. Fingerprints don't lie. That's what we're all told. Fingerprints are unique, one of the most foundational beliefs in forensic science. Every criminal justice professional knows it. Juries certainly believe it. It's presented as objective science. But here's the problem. Fingerprint analysis, while far more reliable than bite marks, is not the purely objective process we've been taught to believe. Fingerprint examiners look at crime scene prints that are often partial, degraded, smudged, or contaminated. They then compare these imperfect images to the suspect's prints. The process involves subjective judgment. Different examiners can reach different conclusions about the same print. Studies have shown that when examiners know they're being tested, they make errors far more frequently than they do in routine casework, suggesting that confirmation bias is at work. In Roy Brown's case, the fingerprint evidence was circumstantial at best. The prints were partial, they weren't definitively identified. Yet an expert testified with apparent certainty. The jury convicted. Roy Brown spent 15 years in prison before DNA evidence exonerated him in 2007. Afterward, an investigation into the fingerprint evidence revealed that the initial examination had been flawed. The prints that supposedly matched his fingerprints could have matched numerous other individuals. The examiner had not followed proper protocols for comparison. What makes this case particularly troubling is that fingerprint analysis is considered the gold standard of forensic science. If flawed fingerprint testimony can contribute to wrongful convictions, what does that say about the reliability of the entire system? Our third case involves yet another widely used forensic technique: hair microscopy. For decades, forensic scientists testified that hair recovered from crime scenes could be matched to suspects with a high degree of certainty. They claimed that hair characteristics, color, texture, root structure, were distinctive enough to identify individuals. Juries, trusting in the expertise of scientists, often convicted based partly on this evidence. Take the case of Anthony Ray Hinton, who was convicted of murder in Alabama in 1985. Hair microscopy evidence played a role in his conviction. Ray Hinton spent 30 years on death row, 30 years, before DNA evidence and legal advocacy from the Equal Justice Initiative secured his exoneration in 2015. The hair evidence that had seemed so damning in 1985 was completely unreliable. Hair microscopy cannot definitively match hair to a specific individual. The FBI later admitted this, and in 2015, the Bureau began reviewing thousands of cases where hair microscopy had been used. Anthony Ray Hinton's exoneration came just in time. He had been scheduled to be executed. But the legal team fighting for him never gave up. They presented new DNA evidence, they exposed the limitations of hair microscopy, and they succeeded in proving that the entire foundation of the prosecution's case rested on flawed science. So what do these three cases, Stinson, Brown, and Hinton, have in common? They all reveal a fundamental truth about the criminal justice system. Forensic evidence has been presented as far more reliable and objective than it actually is. Experts have testified with certainty about evidence that is inherently uncertain. And juries, reasonably trusting in the expertise of scientists, have convicted innocent people. The problem isn't necessarily that experts intentionally lied. Many believed what they were saying. Forensic science in the 1980s and 1990s operated with less oversight and less scientific rigor than it should have. There were few standardized methods. There was no requirement that techniques be validated before they were used in court. Confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret evidence in ways that confirm what you already believe, is a powerful force. When a detective tells a forensic expert that they're confident they have the right suspect, the expert's analysis can be unconsciously influenced by that information. But here's what's changed and what hasn't. As of 2026, the Innocence Project and organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative have worked tirelessly to expose forensic failures. DNA evidence has exonerated over 375 people in America, and forensic mistakes have contributed to many of those wrongful convictions. In response, there have been reforms. The FBI created standards for microscopic hair comparison. Many jurisdictions have implemented blind verification procedures for forensic analysis, where the examiner doesn't know details about the case. Yet significant gaps remain. Bite mark analysis is still used in some courtrooms, even though major forensic organizations have abandoned it. Fingerprint analysis still operates with less scientific validation than we assume. Forensic testimony is still often presented with language that overstates certainty. And defense attorneys often lack the resources to challenge forensic evidence with their own experts. What's particularly troubling is that some of the experts involved in these wrongful convictions faced minimal consequences. Bite mark examiners who testified inaccurately were rarely prosecuted. Fingerprint examiners who made errors were rarely disciplined. The burden of proving that they were wrong fell entirely on the exonerated defendants, and many of those people are still fighting for compensation and justice in 2026. Robert Lee Stinson was eventually exonerated and released, but the state of Oklahoma didn't compensate him until years later. Roy Brown received a settlement but went through an ordeal. Anthony Ray Hinton has become an advocate for wrongful conviction reform, but he spent 3 decades on death row. The lesson from these cases is this: forensic science is a powerful tool, but it is not infallible. It is not objective truth. It is the work of human beings, subject to error, bias, and the limitations of scientific knowledge at any given moment. When an expert testifies in court, they have enormous power over jury decisions, and that power must be matched by genuine scientific rigor and accountability. In 2026, we have better standards. We have DNA evidence. We have blind verification procedures. We have greater awareness of the limitations of forensic science. But we also have thousands of cases sitting in the system, cases decided before these reforms, cases where the underlying forensic evidence may be flawed. The Innocence Project estimates that forensic science failures contributed to roughly half of wrongful convictions. That's not a small number. That's a systemic problem. The fight isn't over. Cases like those of Robert Lee Stinson, Roy Brown, and Anthony Ray Hinton remind us that behind every exoneration is a human being who lost decades of their life, who lost their freedom, their family, their future, who was convicted on evidence that wasn't as certain as it seemed, and who had to fight, sometimes for decades, to prove what should never have been in doubt, that they were innocent. The verdict room, the jury box, the courtroom, these are places where lives are decided, and the evidence presented there must be worthy of that power. Forensic science can be that evidence, but only if we demand rigor, transparency, and accountability at every step. Only if we acknowledge when methods are flawed, and only if we're willing to overturn convictions when science reveals the truth. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to The Verdict Room for more deep dives into the cases that expose the cracks in our justice system. And let me know in the comments, what do you think should happen when forensic experts testify inaccurately? Should they face criminal charges? Should their prior testimony be automatically reviewed? The conversation is happening now. Join us.